Emma was desperate after another milk failure, and the cow's condition was becoming increasingly unstable. She didn't know how to fight it any further. Her eyes read confusion and fatigue, and there was tension in the air. Even the vet couldn't tell exactly what was happening to her. Each morning brought more questions than answers, and Emma felt her heart clench with worry. Chapter 1: Morning Chaos. The sun had barely risen over the small town, casting a warm, golden glow across the farm. The quiet of the early morning was only disturbed by the rustle of leaves in the trees and the soft chirping of birds. In the cozy farmhouse, John and Emma were already awake, as they had been for many years now. Every day started early on the farm, and today was no exception. Emma, her silver hair neatly tied back, moved slowly around the kitchen, preparing breakfast. The smell of freshly baked bread filled the room as she set the kettle on the stove. John, wearing his worn cowboy hat and sturdy boots, stepped outside with a sigh. The cool morning air greeted him as he made his way to the barn. Their farm wasn't large by any means, but it was enough to keep them busy. John and Emma had always lived this way, tending to their animals, growing vegetables in their garden, and enjoying the simple life of hard work and contentment. They had pigs, geese, ducks, rabbits, and 2 cows. Today, like every day, would begin with the familiar chores that made their life on the farm feel like a comforting routine. John approached the barn, where their 2 cows, Bella and Lily, stood quietly in the early morning light. Bella, the older cow, had been their main milk producer for years. Emma would usually milk her in the morning, but as John reached the barn, he noticed something was off. Bella wasn't her usual self. She was standing in the corner, looking distant, her head low and her body slightly hunched. John frowned, feeling a twinge of concern. He opened the barn door carefully, making his way toward her. "Morning, girl," he murmured, trying to keep his voice calm. But Bella didn't respond. She simply stood there, her eyes wide and unblinking. John placed a hand gently on her back, but she didn't flinch. Her usual warmth was absent. "Emma," John called, his voice carrying across the quiet farm. He turned to find her already coming toward him, wiping her hands on her apron. She had been preparing breakfast for them both, but it was clear that something was wrong with Bella. "Something's not right with her," John said, his voice edged with concern. "She won't move, and she looks off." Emma's eyes softened with worry as she approached Bella. She placed her hand on the cow's side and felt a slight tremor. Bella's breathing was shallow, but her gaze remained unfocused, almost distant. "I'll try milking her. See if that helps," Emma said, though there was a hint of uncertainty in her voice. She had been milking cows for decades, but something about Bella's behavior didn't sit right. It wasn't just that she was acting distant. She seemed weak, almost lethargic. The usual spark in her eyes was gone. Emma took the milking stool and positioned herself carefully. But to her surprise, when she tried to milk Bella, nothing came out. She repeated the action, gently pulling at the teats, but the cow offered no milk at all. Emma's stomach sank. This had never happened before. Bella had always been their steady source of milk, a reliable part of their routine. "John, she's not giving anything," Emma said, her voice trembling slightly. "Something's wrong. We need to get the vet." John stood there, his brow furrowed, trying to figure out what could be causing Bella's strange behavior. His mind raced through possibilities. Was it something she ate? Was she sick? But he couldn't come to any conclusion just yet. Before he could say anything, there was a sudden noise coming from the direction of the chicken coop. A loud rustling, followed by a strange squawking, made them both turn their heads. The geese were honking in alarm, and the ducks were flapping their wings in a panic. "What in the world?" John muttered, already moving toward the coop. Emma followed closely behind. When they reached the coop, they saw the ducks and geese in full disarray. They were agitated, their feathers fluffed up, and the noise was deafening. But there was something else. Something was causing them to react this way, something they couldn't see. Suddenly, a loud thud echoed from the barn. It was followed by more rustling, as though something large was moving around in the dark corners of the barn. John's eyes widened in alarm. Emma, something's inside the barn, he said urgently. It's not the usual. The two of them hurried back toward the barn, the sounds of the frantic animals ringing in their ears. As they approached the barn door, the smell of something strange reached their noses, a mix of wet fur and musk. It was then that they saw it. Several raccoons, their dark eyes gleaming in the dim light of the barn, were rummaging through the hay and feed. They had gotten in somehow, and now they were wreaking havoc. Damn it! John cursed under his breath. He quickly moved to close the barn door, but one of the raccoons darted past him, knocking over a bucket of feed and sending it spilling across the floor. The sound of the spill sent the animals into even more of a frenzy. Emma moved quickly to help. She grabbed a broom from the corner of the barn and tried to wave it at the raccoons, but they didn't seem afraid. The barn, normally a peaceful place, had turned into a chaotic mess. John, we need to get them out of here, Emma shouted, struggling to keep the raccoons at bay. John grabbed a large stick, trying to shoo them out of the barn, but they kept darting past him, faster than he had anticipated. They were everywhere, knocking over feed bins, messing with the hay, and even scaring the rabbits in their cages. I'll close the gate, you go get the dogs, John called. Emma nodded, her face flushed with exertion. She ran toward the farmhouse to fetch the dogs. Two old hounds that were good at keeping the farm safe from smaller critters. By the time she returned with the dogs, John had managed to trap most of the raccoons in a corner of the barn. The dogs barked loudly, their deep barks echoing in the barn, and the raccoons, scared, finally bolted for the exit. Thank God, Emma sighed, wiping her forehead with the back of her hand. The animals were beginning to settle down, their panic slowly subsiding. But despite the chaos of the morning, the one issue that lingered in their minds was Bella. John looked at Emma, concern written all over his face. Do you think she's going to be okay? Emma asked, her voice soft with worry. She was used to caring for their animals, but this felt different. Bella's condition was more serious than either of them had expected. John sighed deeply, his hand resting on the barn door. I don't know, Emma, but we have to try. We've got to do everything we can to save her. As the morning went on, the barn slowly quieted, and the animals began to calm down. The raccoons were gone, but the fear in their hearts remained. Emma watched Bella, who was still standing in the corner, her body slumped, her eyes distant. We'll figure this out, Emma said quietly, though she didn't believe her own words. The unease in her stomach continued to grow as she looked at Bella. But as the day passed and the sun climbed higher in the sky, a new worry settled in, one that they could no longer ignore. Bella's condition was serious, and time was running out. End of chapter. The raccoons had caused chaos, but the real problem remained inside the barn. Could they save Bella before it was too late? Chapter 2. The cow's illness mystery. The day after the chaos with the raccoons, a heavy silence settled over the farm. The animals, still rattled by the unexpected intrusion, had returned to their usual routine. But for Emma and John, the unease remained. The biggest concern was Bella, their beloved cow. Emma had spent much of the morning watching her from a distance, noting the way Bella stood with her head low, her once shiny coat now dull and her movements slower than usual. The cow had barely touched her breakfast, something that had never happened before. Emma frowned, feeling a knot tighten in her stomach. She's not eating, John, Emma said, her voice tinged with concern as she approached her husband, who was feeding the pigs in the pen. I've never seen her like this. It's not just that she's not giving milk. She's not even eating her hay. John, who had been busy with his own chores, paused and looked over at Bella. The cow was standing in the corner of the barn, her body slouched and her tail limp. Her eyes, once bright and full of energy, now looked tired and distant. Maybe it's just the shock from yesterday, John suggested, though he didn't sound convinced. She was spooked by the raccoons. Maybe she just needs some time to calm down. But Emma wasn't so sure. Something about Bella's condition felt more serious. The longer she observed the cow, the more she began to worry. I don't know, John. It's been more than a day. She should have snapped out of it by now. John sighed, scratching his stubbled chin. "I'll call the vet. Better to be safe than sorry." He reached for the phone in his pocket and dialed the familiar number. The veterinarian, Dr. Jacobs, was a local, a kind woman who had been taking care of the farm animals for years. She had always been quick to respond, and John trusted her judgment. Within an hour, Dr. Jacobs arrived in her old truck, a box of medical supplies rattling in the back. She wore a warm smile, but Emma could tell that she was worried too. "What seems to be the problem?" Dr. Jacobs asked as she climbed out of the truck, adjusting her glasses. Emma led her to the barn where Bella was standing in the same spot. The vet approached the cow slowly, gently placing her hand on Bella's side. She felt for her heartbeat and listened to her breathing. Bella seemed unusually still, her body trembling slightly under the vet's touch. Dr. Jacobs frowned. "This isn't just a case of stress, I'm afraid. Bella's symptoms are concerning. Is it something serious?" Emma asked, her voice barely above a whisper. She had grown fond of Bella over the years. The thought of losing her was too much to bear. Dr. Jacobs sighed and turned to John and Emma. "It's hard to say just yet, but based on her symptoms, I suspect she may be suffering from an infection. It could be something like mastitis or maybe even a bacterial infection affecting her digestive system." Emma's heart sank at the words. She had heard of mastitis before, but she had never dealt with it personally. The idea that Bella might have an infection, something that could take her from them, was terrifying. "We need to run some tests," Dr. Jacobs continued. "But given the symptoms, it's likely a bacterial infection. It might have started as something minor and spread, affecting her appetite and energy levels." John rubbed the back of his neck, trying to process the news. "What can we do to help her? Can we treat it here? Or does she need to go to the clinic?" Dr. Jacobs thought for a moment. "In most cases like this, we can manage it here with the right antibiotics and treatment. But she'll need to stay under close observation, especially over the next few days. You'll have to monitor her closely, and if there's no improvement within a week, we might need to try something else." Emma nodded, relieved that Bella didn't need to be taken to the clinic, but the weight of the situation still hung heavily over her. "What about natural remedies?" Emma asked, looking at Dr. Jacobs with hope. She had always believed in using herbs and natural treatments alongside conventional medicine when possible. Dr. Jacobs smiled kindly. "Well, there are some herbs that can help with infection, and I'd be happy to give you a list. Just make sure you're careful with dosage. I'll leave you with some antibiotics to start the treatment, and we'll see how she does over the next few days." As the vet prepared the medication and gave instructions on how to administer it, Emma and John exchanged glances. They had always relied on each other when it came to caring for their animals, but this situation felt different. Bella's illness seemed more serious than anything they had faced before. "I'll prepare the herbs," Emma said, feeling a sense of determination settling in. "We'll do everything we can to help her." "Good idea," John agreed. "We've got this, Emma. We just need to stay positive." As Dr. Jacobs packed up her supplies, she turned to Emma and John one last time. "I'll check back in a couple of days, but in the meantime, keep an eye on her. If anything changes, don't hesitate to call." "Thank you, Dr. Jacobs," Emma said, her voice soft with gratitude. After the vet left, John and Emma spent the rest of the day tending to Bella. They made sure she had fresh water and hay, even though she barely touched it. Emma started preparing a mixture of herbs that Dr. Jacobs had recommended. She boiled the herbs carefully, then let them cool before feeding the mixture to Bella. The hours dragged on with little change. Bella still hadn't eaten much, and her energy remained low. Emma stayed by her side, talking to her softly, trying to comfort her. Nightfall came, and the two of them sat in the barn, the only sound being the soft breathing of Bella. Emma's worry was palpable. "Do you think she'll make it through the night?" Emma asked, her voice barely above a whisper. John didn't answer right away. He sat beside her, his hand resting gently on Bella's side. "I don't know, Emma, but we're doing everything we can. That's all we can do." As the night grew darker, Emma and John stayed with Bella, the tension hanging thick in the air. Would their efforts be enough? Or was the illness already too advanced for them to stop? End of chapter. Dr. Jacobs had warned that it might take time, and Bella needed constant monitoring, but Emma couldn't shake the feeling that they were running out of time. Chapter 3: Problems in the Chicken Coop. The day after Bella's troubling condition seemed to worsen, the weight of worry that hung over the farm felt heavier than ever. Emma and John did their best to maintain their usual routine, taking care of Bella with the little energy they had left. But something else was amiss. The animals were restless, the usual harmony of farm life disrupted. Emma was the first to notice. While John worked on feeding the pigs and checking on the other animals, Emma made her way to the chicken coop. She always loved the early morning hours spent collecting eggs, the sunlight filtering through the wooden slats, and the clucking of the hens in the cool barn air. But this morning it felt different. The usual peaceful bustle of the chickens was replaced with frantic movements. The hens were pacing nervously, flapping their wings in agitation. It was a rare sight, and one that unsettled Emma immediately. As she stepped closer to gather the eggs, one of the ducks suddenly quacked loudly and flung itself at her, causing Emma to stumble back. "What on earth?" she muttered to herself, baffled by the unusual behavior. The animals weren't just behaving nervously. They were downright aggressive. Emma reached for a few eggs, but the ducks wouldn't leave her alone. One of the males lunged forward, pecking aggressively at the ground near her feet. The loud flapping of wings and anxious quacking filled the air, and for the first time in years, Emma felt the tension in the air as if something was wrong. She quickly backed away, deciding it was best to let things settle before she continued her chores. But as she turned to leave, her eyes caught something on the ground: strange, shallow marks in the dirt. They were small but distinct, almost like claw marks, dragging through the dust and leading toward the far corner of the coop. Emma knelt down, inspecting the ground carefully. It was odd, but it seemed as if someone, or something, had been digging around the coop. She called to John, who was nearby. "John, you need to see this." John came over quickly, wiping his hands on his jeans, his face lined with exhaustion from the long hours spent tending to Bella. But when he saw the marks on the ground, his expression shifted. He knelt down beside Emma, studying the tracks. "You think it's an animal?" he asked, his voice low. "I'm not sure, but something's definitely been messing with the chickens. This wasn't here last night." "I'm sure of it," Emma replied, standing up and looking around the coop. The ducks had calmed down for the moment, but the unease in the air lingered. John frowned, looking at the strange marks in the dirt again. He could tell they didn't belong to any of the usual animals on the farm. "We need to get the coop locked up tighter," he said with a sense of urgency in his voice. "Could be wild animals trying to get in." Emma's eyes widened. "Do you think it could be raccoons?" John didn't answer immediately. His mind raced as he thought of the raccoons that had invaded the barn just days ago. The more he thought about it, the more he began to wonder. The raccoons had already caused so much trouble, and now the strange behavior of the chickens and the tracks in the dirt only added to his suspicions. "We'll need to reinforce the coop," John said, standing up with a sigh, "and we'll keep an eye out. No sense waiting around to see what happens next." As John went to gather tools to secure the chicken coop, Emma walked a little farther, looking around the perimeter of the barn and the fenced area. There were more odd tracks, footprints, scratches, scattered near the coop's entrance. They didn't seem to belong to any of their farm animals, and Emma felt the hairs on the back of her neck stand up. Her thoughts turned to the raccoons once more. But what if it was something else? Something more dangerous? With a heavy sigh, Emma returned to the coop, her mind racing with possibilities. She watched as John reinforced the wooden doors and made sure the fences were securely latched. But deep down, she knew they weren't the only ones who had noticed the weakness in the coop. Wild animals were smart. They would come back if they had tasted the food of the chickens. The day wore on, and as the evening approached, Emma couldn't shake the feeling of unease. The chickens, now calm, had returned to their usual routine, but the mystery of the strange tracks and the aggressive behavior of the animals weighed on her mind. She made her way back to the barn, glancing nervously over her shoulder. As John finished his work on the coop, he turned to her with a weary expression. "It's secure for now, but we'll have to keep checking it regularly." We can't afford to let our guard down. Emma nodded, relieved that, at least for the moment, the animals were safe. But the tracks on the ground, the strange behavior of the ducks, and the continued silence in the air made her uneasy. That night, as Emma and John settled in their cozy kitchen to have a late dinner, a sense of dread still lingered in the air. They had dealt with their fair share of challenges on the farm, but this felt different. The unsettling thought of the wild animals that roamed just outside the fences nagged at them, especially with Bella's illness still lingering in the back of their minds. John leaned back in his chair, glancing out the window at the darkening sky. "I'll check the tracks again tomorrow," he said, almost to himself. "I'll see if they lead anywhere." Emma was quiet for a moment, then nodded. "Be careful," she said softly, her voice full of concern. John gave her a reassuring smile. "Don't worry, I'll be fine. I'm more worried about Bella." But the truth was, neither of them could shake the feeling that their problems were only just beginning. End of chapter. The next morning, John would follow the tracks, and as he ventured into the woods near the farm, he would discover something that would change everything. Chapter 4, Treating the Cow. The early morning light streamed through the windows, casting a soft glow over the worn kitchen table where John and Emma sat, preparing their remedies. Despite the quiet beauty of the morning, there was an undeniable heaviness in the air. Bella, their beloved cow, had not shown signs of improvement after days of care, and the old couple feared for her health. They had tried everything: herbal teas, warm compresses, and carefully prepared meals of grains and vegetables. Emma had searched through every old book she could find for remedies passed down through generations, and John had used every tool in his workshop, hoping that something would finally ease her suffering. Yet the progress was painfully slow. "We need to do more, John," Emma said softly, her voice tinged with worry as she set another hot poultice on Bella's side. The cow, though weary, accepted the treatment without resistance, but the lack of progress left Emma feeling powerless. John wiped his brow and looked at the cow. "She's tough. She'll pull through. I wish I could do more." The truth was, they were both afraid. Bella had always been a strong and reliable animal, and seeing her so weak made their hearts ache. She wasn't giving milk anymore, and her appetite was erratic. More than that, though, Emma could see the weariness in her eyes, the pain that had been present for days. The veterinarian had been by earlier in the week, but even he didn't have clear answers. He had diagnosed Bella with an infection, but the treatment was slow. Antibiotics, rest, and a diet rich in nutrients were the only solutions they had for now. "Keep an eye on her. If things don't improve, we'll have to take more drastic measures," the vet had said, his words lingering in Emma's mind. It was as if the days were blending together, each one passing with the same fear and uncertainty. They continued with their regular tasks, feeding the pigs, collecting eggs from the chickens, and checking on the rabbits, but always with a heavy heart, knowing that their cow was still struggling. By the 5th day, something shifted, though it was subtle. Bella seemed to be resting more comfortably. Emma noticed that the occasional groans of discomfort were fewer, and the dullness in her eyes began to fade just a little. Emma's heart swelled with cautious hope. "John, look," Emma said, pointing as she stood by the cow's side. "She's not shifting as much. I think she's feeling a bit better." John stepped closer, examining the cow. "Maybe you're right, but she still hasn't given any milk. That's the real worry." Emma nodded. "I know. It's like she's not quite herself yet." Despite the small improvements, the silence in the barn felt heavy. Bella's once sturdy body seemed frail, and Emma could only hope that the treatments they had tried would be enough. Her faith in the old ways of healing was strong, but even she couldn't ignore the nagging thought in the back of her mind. What if it wasn't enough? Later that day, the two of them worked tirelessly to prepare more herbal concoctions and soft foods to encourage Bella's appetite. John made sure she had fresh, clean water at all times, and Emma massaged her gently, trying to help her relax. "John, what if we don't get her milk back?" Emma asked quietly as they watched Bella eat a small portion of the special grain mix they had prepared. "What if she never recovers?" John sighed, his face etched with years of hard work and worry. We'll cross that bridge when we come to it. But I'm not giving up on her. Not now. It was around this time that John's mind wandered back to something he had heard from his own father, an old remedy passed down from his family. It was a folk cure, something that he wasn't sure would actually work, but after everything they had tried, he felt he had nothing to lose. "Emma," he said, his eyes lighting up with a mixture of hope and uncertainty. "I remember my dad used to give his cows a special mix of herbs and a little bit of honey, claiming it helped them recover quicker. Maybe it's worth a shot." Emma looked at him curiously, her expression filled with a cautious sense of curiosity. "Honey and herbs? Yeah, it's an old remedy. I don't know if it'll work, but it can't hurt to try." John shrugged as he prepared the mixture, mixing crushed herbs with a small spoonful of honey and warm water. Emma wasn't entirely convinced but agreed to give it a try. She had seen too many cows get sick over the years, but none had quite reached this level of illness. If there was even a small chance that it could help Bella, she was willing to give it a try. As the sun dipped lower in the sky, the couple sat quietly by Bella's side while she consumed the warm, honeyed mixture. The evening air grew cooler, and the barn settled into an almost serene quiet, the only sounds being Bella's soft chewing and the gentle rustle of hay. "We just need her to get stronger," Emma whispered, her eyes never leaving the cow. That night, John took his usual turn to sit by Bella. The sky outside was pitch black, the moon a sliver in the distance. Emma had gone to bed exhausted from the day's efforts, but her thoughts remained with the cow. As John sat quietly in the dim light, watching Bella's steady breathing, he felt a strange sense of hope. It was still too early to tell, but perhaps the old remedy would work. Perhaps, after all the uncertainty, Bella was finally beginning to turn the corner. End of chapter. But just as John began to relax, the night was interrupted by an unexpected noise. The barn door creaked open, and through the shadows, a familiar, ominous sound filled the air. Something or someone was in the barn with them again. Chapter 5. Nighttime Visitors. The cold night air crept into the barn as John sat by Bella's side, keeping a watchful eye over her as she rested. It had been a long, exhausting day filled with treatments and worry, but for the first time in a while, there was a faint glimmer of hope that Bella was on the mend. The old cow, though still weak, had shown some improvement, and that small change was enough to lift their spirits for a while. But as the night grew darker, the peaceful quiet of the barn was shattered by an unexpected noise. It began as a soft rustling, followed by the distinct sound of something moving in the shadows. John paused, listening intently. He could hear it more clearly now. A series of quick, light footsteps and something scratching along the wooden beams. "Emma," John called softly, his voice barely above a whisper. Emma stirred from the corner of the barn where she had been sleeping in a small cot. She blinked in confusion, trying to shake off the grogginess of sleep. "What is it?" she asked, her voice still thick with sleep. "Something's in the barn," John murmured, straining his ears. "I think it's animals. Lots of them." Before Emma could respond, a loud crash echoed through the barn. The two of them rushed to the source of the noise, where they saw the unmistakable sight of raccoons, a whole group of them, scurrying through the hay, knocking over buckets, and rummaging through the food they had carefully prepared for their animals. "God! Look at them!" Emma exclaimed, her eyes wide with disbelief. "They're everywhere." The raccoons, completely unbothered by the humans, continued their scavenging spree. They dug into the bags of feed, pulling out grains and pellets, while others worked on the vegetables that had been set aside for the pigs. The chaos was palpable as the barn erupted into a frenzy of movement. John grabbed a broom and tried to scare them off, but the raccoons were determined. One of them darted toward the chicken's feed, while another climbed up the side of the wall, knocking over a lantern in the process. The light flickered for a moment before the barn was plunged into darkness, leaving them in a frantic scramble. "Get away from there!" John shouted, swinging the broom toward the nearest raccoon. In the confusion, one of the animals yelped as it was struck by the bristles, stumbling back. "Oh no," Emma said, her voice laced with worry as she watched the raccoon scramble for cover. "You didn't hurt it?" Did you? I didn't mean to, John muttered, his face flushed with frustration. But they're wrecking everything. Emma hurried to the back of the barn, trying to calm the animals who were now panicking. The chickens were flapping wildly, and the pigs began grunting in distress. She reached for the hens, holding them close to her chest to keep them from flying into a frenzy. John swung the broom again, but the raccoons were relentless. He didn't want to hurt them, but they were causing too much damage, and the stress on the animals was overwhelming. We need to get them out of here, John said, his voice tight with frustration. Emma, help me with the door. We need to shut them in. Together, they struggled to push the barn door closed, but one raccoon managed to slip through, darting past them and into the shadows. John slammed the door shut behind it with a heavy thud, leaving them alone in the barn again. Breathing heavily, hearts racing, but with the barn in ruins. We have to do something about this, Emma said, her voice shaking with anxiety. They'll just keep coming back. John wiped his brow, thinking, I'll set some traps tomorrow. We'll have to catch them before they do more damage. Emma nodded, but she was still worried. What if they bring something in with them? What if they spread disease to the animals? The thought lingered in the air, heavy and unsettling. John nodded grimly. We can't risk that. We'll have to take extra precautions. With that, they moved quickly to check on the animals, making sure none of the birds or pigs had been hurt in the chaos. Bella was still resting, but Emma felt a fresh sense of dread creeping up her spine. They were fighting a battle on multiple fronts now. Not just against Bella's illness, but against the forces of nature itself. And every day it seemed like the stakes were getting higher. The old couple spent the next few hours cleaning up the mess. They carefully swept the hay into piles, removed the broken lantern, and sorted through the scattered feed. Though the barn was in disarray, they felt a strange sense of determination. They wouldn't let these animals, be they raccoons or anything else, defeat them. As the last of the raccoons slipped out of the barn into the night, the couple made their way to the house, exhausted but resolved. The night was cold, and the sky was littered with stars, but the danger still loomed over them. They knew it wasn't over. End of chapter. But just as they began to feel a bit of relief, the rustle of leaves outside the barn caught their attention. A low growl echoed through the darkness, sending a chill down their spines. Something else was out there. Something bigger. Chapter 6. The Raccoon Chase. The morning sun had barely risen when John, with his worn-out hat and heavy boots, set about preparing the traps. The night had been long and restless, filled with the echoes of the raccoons' havoc. They couldn't risk letting these animals return again. John moved methodically, placing traps along the barn's perimeter, checking every corner where the animals might sneak in. He had dealt with the occasional animal intruder before, but never something this persistent. Emma, meanwhile, was inside the barn, inspecting the damage. The air smelled of disturbed hay, and the once quiet space now felt tense, as if the walls themselves were holding their breath. She noticed the cracks in the wood, where the raccoons had clawed their way in, and the spilled feed that littered the floor like a scattering of gold dust, wasted. Her heart sank when she saw the mess in the chicken coop. The hens, although safe, had been thoroughly shaken up. She took a deep breath, trying to calm herself as she sorted through the wreckage. As she did, she noticed something troubling. There were fresh paw prints leading into the barn, and they didn't look like raccoon prints. They were much larger. John, you need to see this, she called out, her voice tinged with unease. John came over quickly, wiping his hands on his trousers. He squatted next to the tracks, his brow furrowing. These aren't raccoons, he muttered, more to himself than to Emma. Something else has been here. He stood up, dusting himself off. We need to get those traps in place fast. Whatever it is, we can't have it roaming around. The day passed in a blur of activity. John fixed the traps, while Emma worked to calm the animals and clean up the mess. But as the sun began to dip behind the trees, the unease that had settled over the farm grew heavier. Neither of them could shake the feeling that something worse was lurking in the dark. That night, with the moon high in the sky, John and Emma prepared for their first night hunt together. They both understood the importance of taking action now, before the situation got any worse. With flashlights in hand, they moved cautiously around the perimeter of the barn, checking the traps and listening for any signs of movement. The silence of the night was oppressive. The only sounds were the occasional hoot of an owl and the distant rustle of wind in the trees. Emma felt the hairs on the back of her neck stand on end. She hadn't been this on edge in years. And then, just as they were about to return to the house, they heard a faint rustling from the nearby bushes. John froze, his eyes scanning the dark for any sign of movement. Suddenly, a loud snap echoed through the air. They rushed toward the noise, only to find one of the traps had caught something. "A raccoon," John said, his voice a mixture of relief and frustration. "At least we've got one of them." He crouched down to check the animal, ensuring it was safely contained. The raccoon snarled from inside the cage, furious at being trapped, but there was little it could do now. Emma exhaled in relief. "That's one problem solved," she said, her voice slightly more relaxed. But John wasn't convinced. "We still don't know what's lurking around here. The prints I found, those weren't from a raccoon." They decided to keep watch, staying outside for a while longer to make sure no other animals would try to enter. They sat on the porch, their eyes scanning the dark, every rustle of leaves making them jump. As the night wore on, John finally suggested they check the chicken coop one more time before heading to bed. Emma agreed, and they both made their way back to the barn. The chickens had calmed down considerably, but Emma still couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. It was then that she noticed something on the floor of the coop. A broken egg. She knelt down to inspect it, her heart sinking as she realized what it meant. "John, look at this," she said, her voice tinged with dread. John walked over, his face pale as he saw the shattered shell. "No," he muttered. "It can't be. Could the raccoons have done this?" Emma asked, her mind racing. John shook his head. "No, the raccoons didn't have the chance. This must have happened after we set the traps." They stood in silence for a moment, the weight of the discovery settling over them. The broken egg was a sign, one that confirmed their worst fears. Something was still out there, something more dangerous than a few hungry raccoons. End of chapter. Emma's mind was a whirlwind of possibilities, but before she could voice her concerns, the sound of something heavy scraping across the barn floor echoed from the shadows. A low growl followed. The hunt was far from over. Chapter 7. Restoring Order. The early morning light filtered through the trees, casting long shadows across the farm. John and Emma were already hard at work, determined to finally restore order after the chaos of the past few days. The raccoons had been relentless, and the farm had suffered, but they weren't going to let that stop them. John paced around the barn, inspecting every corner, making sure the barriers were tight. The traps had been successful, but he knew it wasn't enough. Wild animals were clever, and they would find new ways to sneak in if they had the chance. So, he set about reinforcing the wooden gates and checking for any weak spots in the fencing. Every board had to be secure. Meanwhile, Emma was working on the chicken coop. She was replacing some of the broken slats with sturdier wood, making sure there was no way for any more predators to get inside. The chickens were still jittery from the raccoons' invasion, but they were settling down now. Emma could feel a sense of calm settling over her as she worked, knowing that with every repair, the farm would be a little safer. By midday, they were both exhausted, but there was no time to rest. The farm was depending on them, and they couldn't afford to stop. They had already spent the morning tending to the animals, feeding the pigs and checking on the rabbits, but the most pressing concern was still their beloved cow, Bella. John knew the treatments they'd been trying weren't enough. The vet had given them some advice, but the cow's condition hadn't improved much. Her energy was low, and she still wouldn't give milk, which only made the old couple more worried. John had seen her thrive in the past, and the thought of losing her weighed heavily on his heart. He made a quick decision. "Emma, let's call the vet again. We need to know if there's something else we can try." Emma agreed, looking at the tired cow as she munched on her hay. "I think you're right," she said. "We've done all we can, but we don't want to take any chances." Within the hour, the vet arrived. He brought a fresh supply of medications, as well as a few new ideas on how to speed up Bella's recovery. He suggested a combination of antibiotics and a special nutritional supplement to boost her strength. Emma, always eager to do whatever it took, listened carefully to the vet's instructions and made sure she had everything ready for Bella. "I've seen cows bounce back from this," the vet reassured them. "It just might take some time." The old couple wasn't sure how much longer they could go on with the uncertainty hanging over them, but they trusted the vet's advice. Emma spent the next few hours carefully administering the new medication to Bella, making sure she was comfortable and calm. John worked beside her, ensuring the barn was in order and the animals were all secure. By the time evening fell, the barn had taken on a quiet, peaceful atmosphere. The animals were all fed and settled in for the night. The sky was a deep purple, and the only sound was the occasional rustle of hay or the soft cluck of a chicken. The air felt fresh and clean, as if the chaos of the past week was finally starting to settle. But despite the calmness, there was still an undercurrent of worry. As John looked around the farm, his tired eyes scanning the horizon, he couldn't shake the feeling that something else was lurking, waiting to challenge their peace. Later that night, as they sat on the porch, taking a well-earned rest, Emma noticed something strange. She had just finished washing up the dinner dishes when she heard the familiar sound of Bella shifting in her stall. When Emma went to check, she gasped in surprise. Bella was standing, her head slightly lowered, but something had changed. The cow was milking again. "John," Emma called, rushing back outside to grab him. "Come quickly." John, already half asleep in his chair, sprang to his feet. When he saw Bella, a wave of relief washed over him. She was still weak, but there was milk, real milk, dripping from her udder. A sign that maybe, just maybe, they were on the right track. "This is it," John murmured, a smile tugging at his lips. "She's on the mend." But as Emma examined Bella more closely, her concern returned. The cow's health was still fragile. She wasn't out of the woods yet. The signs of improvement were there, but Emma knew they couldn't relax just yet. End of chapter. As they stood together, watching Bella carefully, Emma noticed the cow's slow, labored movements. Her heart tightened again with worry. There was progress, but she knew the journey wasn't over. Chapter 8: Milk Troubles. The early morning light filtered through the barn's wooden slats, casting long shadows over the animals' resting places. John and Emma had just finished their morning rounds, but despite their best efforts, things weren't improving as they'd hoped. Bella, the cow, had begun producing milk again, but the milk was off, thin and spoiled. Emma could tell by the smell alone. "Something's wrong, John," she said, holding the bucket away from her. "This isn't right. This milk isn't fit to drink." John sighed deeply, wiping his brow with the back of his hand. He had hoped that the worst was over once Bella started milking again, but the situation seemed to have taken a turn for the worse. He had watched her carefully all week, administering the medications the vet prescribed and following the doctor's advice. But the progress had been slow, and now, with the milk so poor, he feared they were back at square one. "I'll have to change her feed," John said, his voice resolute. "I'll add more of those herbs we've been growing in the garden. Maybe some fresh grain too. That should help her recover. She needs more nutrients." Emma nodded, though she didn't look convinced. She loved Bella dearly, and seeing her struggle so much made her heart ache. She wanted to believe the solution was as simple as adding a few new ingredients to the cow's diet, but the reality of the situation felt much more complicated. Later that day, they went into the pasture, gathering handfuls of fresh herbs that they had planted just for moments like these. They had been growing mint, thyme, and clover, all known for their health benefits for livestock. John mixed these herbs into Bella's hay, hoping to boost her appetite and give her the strength she needed. Along with the herbs, he added an extra serving of oats and barley, knowing that these would help with her digestion and overall health. As the day wore on, the couple checked on Bella every few hours, making sure she had enough food and water. They also kept a close eye on the temperature in the barn. The nights had been getting colder, and they knew that keeping Bella comfortable was just as important as the food she ate. They made sure to keep the fire stoked in the nearby stove, creating a warm, cozy space for her to rest. The warmth seemed to calm her, and for a moment, Emma thought she saw some improvement. Bella looked less tired than she had the previous days, and she was chewing her food more vigorously. But by evening, when they checked on her again, their relief was short-lived. Bella's milk was still poor, thin and watery, and her movements were sluggish. She didn't seem to have the same energy she once had. She would occasionally lift her head to nibble at the hay, but there was something about her behavior that wasn't quite right. Emma watched her for a long time from the door of the barn, her heart heavy with worry. John came up behind her, his boots scraping the gravel. "She's not the same, is she?" Emma shook her head. "No, she's not. She's still so weak. I don't know what to do, John. We've tried everything." They stood in silence for a moment, the weight of the situation settling on their shoulders. Emma's heart ached for Bella, but more than that, she felt helpless. Every effort they made to save her seemed to be met with failure. Was there something they were missing? Something more they could do to bring her back to health? That night, after a long, exhausting day of tending to the animals, they sat together on the porch, watching the stars twinkle in the cool night sky. Their minds were heavy with the uncertainty of what would happen next. John, ever the problem solver, refused to give up. "I'll search for something else," he said, determination in his voice. "There's got to be something we haven't tried yet. I'll look into some of those old remedies folks used back when I was a boy. Maybe it's time to bring in some of the natural stuff." Emma looked at him, her eyes tired but hopeful. "I trust you, John. If anyone can find a solution, it's you." They didn't say much more that night. They both knew they were facing a battle, but they also knew that they weren't going to give up on Bella. Not now, not ever. End of chapter. The next morning, after another disappointing milking session, Emma stood in the barn, staring at the floor in despair. Bella's health seemed to be getting worse rather than better, and the milk was once again spoiled. Emma's heart sank. How much longer could they keep fighting this battle? Would they be able to save Bella, or was it already too late? Chapter 9. Unexpected Turns. For the first time in weeks, Bella seemed to show signs of life. As the early morning light streamed into the barn, the old cow lifted her head, her once heavy eyelids now more alert than they had been in days. Emma, who had been watching her closely, couldn't believe her eyes. "John!" she called out, her voice filled with hope. "Come quick! Bella's up. She's eating." John rushed into the barn, his boots crunching against the straw-covered floor. When he saw Bella munching on the hay with more vigor than she'd shown in days, he stopped in his tracks, a mixture of relief and confusion washing over him. "Well, I'll be. She's finally eating like she used to." They both watched in silence, as if afraid to disturb the moment. Bella's body seemed more energized, and her eyes were brighter, full of life. It was as though the months of sickness had vanished overnight, and Emma and John dared to hope that their efforts might have paid off. But even as they watched their beloved cow, they knew the struggle wasn't over. The milk was still not up to par. While Bella seemed to be recovering physically, the quality of the milk remained questionable. It wasn't enough. They still couldn't drink it, and John could see the worry in Emma's eyes as she milked the cow once again. "Maybe there's something more we can do," John muttered, running a hand through his thinning hair. "I'll have a look at those old recipes I've been hearing about. My grandmother used to swear by them." Emma nodded, though her expression was far from convinced. "I don't know, John. It feels like we've tried everything, and I'm just not sure there's a simple answer." But John wasn't so easily discouraged. He spent the rest of the day researching, going through old farming books and notes he'd kept over the years. It was then that he came across a recipe he hadn't thought about in years. An herbal concoction that was supposed to help improve both the health of the cow and the quality of her milk. The recipe called for a combination of thyme, sage, and fennel, all known for their digestive and restorative properties. It was a method that had been passed down through generations of farmers. John wasn't entirely sure it would work, but at this point he was willing to try anything. That afternoon, with the herbs in hand, John mixed them into Bella's feed. As Emma watched, she felt a flicker of hope again. It wasn't much, but after so many failed attempts, Even the smallest possibility seemed worth grasping. By the time they finished, it was nearly dusk, and Bella had already begun to show signs of improvement. She seemed to enjoy the new mix, finishing her food more quickly than before. And when Emma milked her later that night, the results were startling. While the milk still wasn't perfect, it was definitely better than it had been. "John, I think we might be onto something here," Emma said cautiously, examining the milk. "It's not spoiled, and it looks thicker." "I told you," John replied with a tired smile. "Sometimes the old ways work best." Yet, despite the small victory, Emma couldn't shake the feeling that the true recovery was still far away. She knew that healing Bella would take time, more than they'd hoped, but for the first time in weeks she could breathe easier. There was progress, even if it was slow. As night fell over the farm, the two of them sat in the porch swing, looking out over the quiet fields. For a while they didn't speak, just enjoying the peace of the moment. But that peace didn't last long. Just as they were about to retire for the night, they heard a rustling sound from the direction of the barn. At first, it seemed like the wind, but then it came again. A low, muffled noise, as though something was stirring around in the barn. "John, did you hear that?" Emma asked, her voice trembling with unease. John immediately stood up, his hand instinctively reaching for the old rifle he kept by the door. "It's probably just a raccoon or something," he said, though his voice didn't sound as certain as he'd hoped. They cautiously approached the barn, their boots crunching on the gravel as they moved. The sound grew louder, more distinct, a series of small, scurrying noises coming from inside the barn. Emma's heart began to race. "It's not the wind. Something's in there." When they reached the barn door, John paused. He glanced at Emma, his face etched with concern. "Stay back," he said, pushing the door open slowly. What they saw sent a chill down their spines. There, in the dim light of the barn, shadows shifted across the floor. As their eyes adjusted, they realized with horror that it wasn't just a single creature. It was a whole group of them, moving in and out of the stalls, rummaging through the feed. "Not again," John muttered, his grip tightening on the rifle. "Those damn raccoons." But there was something more to it this time. The creatures were quick, darting around in the dark, knocking over feed bins and scattering the animals. It was chaos all over again. End of chapter. As they stood frozen, trying to figure out what to do, they heard a rustling coming from the back of the barn. The sounds grew louder and more frantic, and Emma's heart skipped a beat. What could it be now? Chapter 10. Peace on the farm. The days that followed were a welcome change for John and Emma. Slowly, the farm began to return to its normal rhythm. The health of the animals improved, and most importantly, Bella was steadily recovering. While she wasn't back to her prime just yet, she was stronger, more active, and finally producing milk that was fit to drink. The milk wasn't as abundant as it once had been, but it was enough for their needs, and that was a blessing in itself. John spent the mornings with the animals, checking on them and making sure they were comfortable. Bella, who had once been sluggish and unwilling to move, now followed him around the barn, eager for the extra attention. He smiled every time he saw her more lively, less the shell of the animal she had been just a few weeks ago. Emma, on the other hand, spent her afternoons in the garden. The flowers were blooming again, and the vegetables they'd planted months earlier were finally showing their promise. She had always loved tending to her garden, watching as each tiny seed grew into something that would feed them or brighten their home. It was a small joy, but it had become her solace in the midst of everything they had been through. And it was the little things, like watching the sun set behind the hills, feeling the cool evening breeze brush against her skin, that brought Emma peace. The farm, which had once seemed so full of chaos and stress, now felt like a haven again. "Look at that," John said one evening as they sat together on the porch swing, a warm cup of tea in his hands. He pointed toward the barn where the animals were peacefully resting in their enclosures. The calm was almost surreal after all they had endured. "The animals are happier. Everything feels right again," Emma said softly, leaning against him. It had taken more work than they had ever expected, but they had made it through. The raccoons, the illnesses, the fears, they all seemed so distant now. The barn, once torn apart by chaos and the constant threat of wild animals, now stood sturdy, protected by new fences and reinforced locks. The animals were safe, and the peace they had worked so hard for had returned. The evenings were quiet, and their walks through the garden felt almost magical. Emma would walk slowly between the rows of tomatoes and zucchini, feeling the earth beneath her feet. John would sometimes follow, silently enjoying the time they spent together. They had learned to savor these moments, to appreciate the peace they had worked so hard to find. As the weeks passed, the farm began to thrive again. The pigs were healthy, the chickens were laying eggs regularly, and the garden seemed to bloom more vibrantly than ever. John and Emma had once worried that they would never recover from the difficulties they had faced, but now they realized that the worst was behind them. On one such evening, as the golden light of the sunset bathed the farm, they stood side by side, looking out at the sprawling fields. The sounds of the animals, the rustling leaves in the breeze, the chirping of birds, it all blended into a perfect symphony of peace. "Do you think it'll stay this way?" Emma asked, a note of caution still lingering in her voice, despite the calm she felt. John nodded, his hand resting lightly on her shoulder. "I think we've done everything we could. It's in the hands of the land and the animals now. But we'll keep watch, like we always do." Emma smiled, leaning into him. "I think we've earned a little peace." They didn't need to say more. They had both learned the value of patience, the importance of persistence, and the quiet joy that came with watching something grow, whether it was a crop, an animal, or even their own spirits. As the days turned into weeks, the farm continued to thrive. No more raccoons, no more sicknesses, and no more worries about Bella's health. It was as if the dark cloud that had loomed over them had finally passed. For the first time in a long while, they could look forward to tomorrow without fear. But just as they were beginning to feel truly secure, as they walked together one evening down the familiar path to the garden, a strange sound caught their attention. It was faint at first, barely audible above the evening birdsong. But then it grew clearer, a rustling, followed by a faint scratching noise, almost like something was moving in the barn. John and Emma stopped in their tracks, exchanging a quick glance. For a moment, the calm of the evening seemed to shatter. But then John let out a deep breath, his lips curling into a reassuring smile. "Probably just the wind or one of the animals," he said. "We've got it under control, Emma. Don't worry." Emma smiled back, feeling the weight of his words. She nodded, and the two of them continued their walk, the strange sound now just a background murmur to the peaceful night. End of chapter. The faint rustling continued in the distance, but John and Emma no longer felt the same unease. With their years of experience and care for the land and animals, they had learned one valuable lesson. No matter what tomorrow might bring, they were ready to face it together.